Hello physics research peers, welcome to Lab 3, the Complete Interferometry System by Derrick and Ryan Little. This experiment is split into 4 parts. I'll be talking through the first 2, while Ryan will handle the last 2. Today we are looking at 4 different experimental applications of the Michelson interferometer. Let's start with a little background. This experiment was originally devised by Albert Michelson and Edward Morley in the 1880s. It was devised to test for the existence of the luminiferous aether, which was a hypothetical medium through which light travels, in the same way that sound travels through air. Though the experiment was unsuccessful, the apparatus was found to have many other applications in science. The apparatus is summarized below. A helium neon laser light with a wavelength of 633 nanometers is shot through a beam splitter. The beam splitter transmits half of the light to the movable mirror on the right, and reflects half to the fixed mirror above. The light reflects off of these 2 mirrors, and half of each of these beams is then combined onto the viewing screen below. Because the beam transmitted to the movable mirror has traveled some longer or shorter distance equal to 2d, the 2 beams are no longer in phase when they hit the viewing screen. Placing a lens in the front of the laser spreads the light out so we can view the resulting interference pattern of light with dark fringes. That's what you see on the right. Moving the movable mirror slightly by a length d will change the position of the minima and maxima of the interference pattern. The number of times the fringe pattern is restored to its original minima and maxima position for a given movement is directly related to several variables of interest. Today we will apply the Michelson interferometer in making 4 different experimental measurements. The original wavelength of the laser, 633 nanometers, the refractive index of air, the refractive index of glass, and the speed of light. Let's start with experiment 1. Experiment 1 is set up similarly to what was discussed in the theory. We use a micrometer to move the movable mirror by some distance d. The beam going to the movable mirror then has to travel some extra or lesser distance 2d. In this case, we move the mirror closer. Moving the mirror half a wavelength closer will switch the minima and maxima points of the fringe pattern. Moving it a full wavelength closer will restore the fringe pattern to its original orientation. Thus the relationship between the distance moved and the number of times the fringe pattern makes one transition can be derived to calculate the wavelength of the light. After setting up the apparatus, we projected the interference pattern onto a whiteboard about 1 meter away from the fixed mirror. Whiteboard markers were drawn on the edges of the fringes to make it easier to count the fringe transitions. A micrometer knob, pictured here, was rotated slowly counterclockwise. A set number of fringe pattern transitions was counted and compared with the displacement of the movable mirror. This was done for several trials of n, the number of transitions. The weighted mean of these wavelength trials was then calculated. The results for 7 different trials are pictured here. Because a different number of fringes was measured for each trial, we need to get a weighted mean. We would expect that more fringe counts would give a more accurate measurement. Measurements for 20 fringes, for example, gave a wavelength of 850 nanometers, which is very far off the mark. Indeed, the non-weighted mean was calculated to be 699.285 nanometers. This is quite far from the actual value of 633 nanometers. The weighted mean was calculated to be 663 plus or minus 9.9 nanometers. This is still far off our actual mark of 633. There are several possible explanations for this discrepancy. Firstly, the fringes were quite difficult to count even with the markers. Though 2 people counted the fringes at the same time, it was difficult to move the micrometer slow enough to count accurately. The uncertainty in the count was plus or minus 1, though this could have been made higher for higher values of n. The micrometer has some kickback, which is why we could only rotate counterclockwise. The degree to which this affected the measurement is uncertain. Additionally, the alignment of the laser was quite a difficult process. If the interference pattern was projected at an angle, we wouldn't be able to count the fringes very accurately. Now let's move on to experiment 2. Experiment 2 has a similar setup. This time, however, the movable mirror is kept fixed. A small vacuum chamber is placed in front of the movable mirror, which is then connected to a handheld vacuum pump. The 48mm lens is switched out with an 18mm lens. We adjust the air inside the cell to a vacuum of 0 atmospheres, then pumped in air up to a certain point and evacuated it several times, adding more air every time. In this case, the vacuum pump only goes up to 0.85 atmospheres. We can find the refractive index of air by finding the slope of the refractive index and pressure, using the known wavelength, number of transitions, width of the vacuum cell, and the pressure. Let's look at our results. Here we plotted the change in refractive index with the change in pressure. The slope of this relationship can be used to estimate the refractive index of air at 1 atmosphere of 100 kilopascals. From the line of best fit, we found the refractive index of air to be 1.00022. This is only measured to a 73% accuracy to the commonly accepted value of 1.00029. This time, counting the fringe transitions was even more difficult, because the fringes moved faster as air was pumped in. Furthermore, we always round the number of fringe transitions to the nearest integer. In reality, the number of fringes counted could have been a decimal. The vacuum pump that we used did not pump up to 1 atmosphere. This limits the accuracy of the estimate at 1 atmosphere.
Experiment 3 involved finding the refractive index of a glass plate. To set up this experiment, a glass plate 5.6mm thick was placed on a rotatable mount in the center of the configuration. The image displayed showed 2 sets of 3 red dots, which using the knobs on the adjustable mirror were aligned to create an interference pattern. This pattern was projected onto the wall and a 48mm lens was placed at the viewing screen to magnify the image. An 18mm lens was placed at the start of the configuration as well, which remained in place from the last experiment. It was hypothesized that as the glass plate rotated, the path length of light through the glass would increase as shown from the figure. Equation 1 shown below was used to derive equation 2, also shown below, which was used to calculate the refractive index of the glass plate used in this experiment. I won't go into the specifics of these equations, but they are shown here on the slide. To obtain the refractive index, we moved the mirror 5, 10 and 15 degrees for trials 1, 2 and 3, respectively. The number of fringes during this displacement was observed by human eye and recorded. These values were used in equation 2 in the slide above to determine a refractive index for the glass plate. The refractive indices calculated using each angle were as follows. 5 degrees harbored an index of 2.214, 10 degrees 1.806, 15 degrees 1.788, which resulted in an average refractive index of 1.936. Straight away in our analysis, we see that these indices are quite large. They become more logical when we measured higher angles, but still much larger than the desired value of about 1.5, which is the refractive index of commonly used glass. This is strange, because our main problem during this experiment was counting the number of fringes. During the observations of the larger angles, we had much more trouble obtaining an accurate value for the number of fringes because they were moving very fast and were hard to observe. So although the index was becoming more accurate with a larger angle, the rate of error was becoming much higher due to our ability to count the number of fringes. It can be seen from this graph that the number of fringes from each 5 degrees of angle increased. This is why it was harder to observe the number of fringes at higher angles, because the number of fringes became larger and larger as the angle increased. As an overview, our observation method was too prone to error. We needed larger angles to record more accurate figures, but these larger angles were too hard to observe, as the number of fringes were too frequent to count. A possible method of improving this experiment would be to undergo more trials to produce more precise figures and negate the effects of error. Our final value of 1.936 was about 30% larger than predicted, which is not a desirable outcome. It can't be said that the refractive index was 1.936, as the amount of error was too large, and a repeat of this experiment would have to be performed to retrieve a more accurate figure. Experiment 4 was a much shorter experiment, which involved removing the beam splitter and instead using the adjustable mirror in line with the movable mirror to create an image on the other side of both. Once again, the 18mm lens remained, and a 48mm lens was used to magnify the interference pattern produced. The known values of the laser's wavelength and the speed of light in a vacuum were used to calculate a value for frequency. Using the discovered value of d in this experiment, we calculated the wavelength in the medium of air. Multiplying this value with the frequency allowed us to calculate the speed of light in air, which could be corrected with the refractive index of air to obtain the speed of light in a vacuum. So, as stated before, we needed to find the value of d, which was found by moving the micrometer knob, which moved the mirror in our configuration back and forth. The knob was moved until 100 fringes were observed by the human eye, and the initial and final position of the knob were recorded to find the displacement, d. Our final value for the speed of light in a vacuum was 107% of the actual speed of light in a vacuum. The results can be seen here. Time limitations in the lab only allowed for 2 trials in this experiment, which were relatively close to each other. This experiment was quite a short one, and made even shorter with our time limitations. However, obtaining a value within 8% of the actual speed of light was relatively accurate, considering only 2 trials were performed. Once again, our method of human observation allowed for error, as it was possible for us to miscount the 100 fringes and retrieve an inaccurate displacement value. This experiment could have been improved dramatically, with more time so that we could record more observations. Analysing the results of this lab, it can be seen straight away that there was a very large amount of error, mostly due to the counting of fringes, as using human observation is prone to error. On top of this, each separate experiment had their own sources of error, such as equipment and time limitations. This resulted in an undesirable outcome, which, although undesirable, were due to errors that can be fixed in future experiments. Using advanced observation equipment with more time to undergo a larger amount of trials would help retrieve more accurate values.